Hello there, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a quiet place where curiosity doesn't have to perform, where big questions can stretch out slowly, and where science is allowed to take the scenic route so your mind doesn't have to rush anywhere. Tonight, wherever you're listening from, whether the lamp is still on or the room has already slipped into darkness, I hope you can let your thoughts settle just a little as we begin. Because tonight, we're going to explore an idea that doesn't shout for attention. It doesn't demand belief. It just waits, patiently, beneath the surface of deep time. The idea is this. Before our familiar history began, before the first cities we memorize in school, before writing, before memory itself had anything sturdy enough to hold on to, there may have been another beginning. Not a mythological beginning full of gods and thunder, not a spectacle meant to impress, but a quiet, earthly beginning shaped by stone and water, heat and pressure, erosion and time. It's easy to say, but it opens something vast. What if the first civilization did not rise and fall in the world we recognize? What if it lived on a planet that was still whole, when all the continents were joined together as one immense landmass, long before the Earth began its slow, indifferent work of tearing itself apart? Before we wander too far into that possibility, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Maybe it's late night for you, or very early morning, or that strange in-between hour when time feels soft around the edges. What part of the world are you in as you hear these words? And what does the earth beneath you look like there? The ground under us feels permanent, dependable, unmoving. It's easy to forget that the place you're sitting or lying down was not always where it is now, and it will not remain there forever. If this gentle exploration feels calming or sparks that quiet kind of wonder that doesn't need an answer right away, you're always welcome to stay close to this space. But for now, there's nothing you need to do except listen and let the story unfold at its own pace. Now imagine the Earth not as a globe of scattered continents separated by wide oceans, but as a single sprawling world of land. No Atlantic Ocean, no Pacific, no Indian Ocean carving distance between shores. Instead, there is one immense supercontinent stretching from pole to pole, ringed by a vast global sea. This was Pangaea, not a fantasy, not a guess, but a well-supported chapter in Earth's history. Long before humans, before mammals, before dinosaurs even had their long reign, the continents were locked together like puzzle pieces that had not yet been pulled apart. Rivers ran for thousands of miles without ever meeting an ocean. Mountain ranges rose where continental plates pressed into one another, not knowing yet that one day those same mountains would be separated by hemispheres. When we picture ancient civilizations, our minds reach for familiar images almost automatically. Stone temples, city walls, pottery shards, written symbols pressed into clay or carved into rock. We imagine them nestled beside rivers or coastlines that still exist today, their ruins waiting patiently to be uncovered. But that picture rests on an assumption one so quiet, we rarely notice it. It assumes that civilization must leave behind traces that survive the relentless churn of geological time. It also assumes the Earth itself has stayed mostly unchanged across the span in which intelligent life could arise. Both assumptions feel reasonable when we think in thousands of years, or even tens of thousands. They become much less certain when we stretch our thinking across hundreds of millions. Pangaea existed roughly between 300 million and 200 million years ago, give or take. That is a span of time so long it swallows the entire history of our species again and again. Modern humans have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Even our earliest hominin ancestors go back only a few million. Dinosaurs ruled the Earth for about 160 million years. Pangaea itself formed, lived, and began to break apart across a timeline that dwarfs all of these familiar markers. During that time, climates shifted dramatically. Ice ages came and went, seas rose and fell. Entire lineages of life appeared, flourished, and vanished without leaving more than faint chemical signatures behind. And it is within this immense stretch of deep time that a quiet question begins to take shape. Could complex intelligence have arisen earlier than we think, lived for a time, and then been erased so thoroughly by the Earth's own processes that almost nothing recognizable remains? Not erased by catastrophe alone, but by erosion, by subduction, metamorphism, and the slow recycling of crust back into the mantle. The Earth is not a museum that carefully preserves everything that happens on its surface. It is more like a restless workshop, constantly melting down its own creations to make something new. When continents collide, mountains rise. When continents pull apart, oceans are born. But when one tectonic plate slides beneath another, entire landscapes are dragged downward, crushed, heated, and transformed beyond recognition. Any cities, roads, or structures built on those surfaces would not simply crumble into ruins. They would be ground into minerals, folded into rock layers, and eventually melted. Even the oceans are not safe archives. The seafloor is constantly renewed, new crust forming at mid-ocean ridges, old crust sinking back into the earth. The oldest ocean floor we know of today is less than 200 million years old. Anything older has already been recycled. So if an early civilization had existed during the age of Pangaea, its physical traces would face a nearly impossible challenge. They would need to survive hundreds of millions of years of tectonic movement, weathering, chemical alteration, and biological activity. Wood would rot, metals would corrode and disperse, stone would fracture, dissolve, or be transformed under pressure and heat. Even if something endured for a time, it might end up buried miles deep or pulverized into sediment indistinguishable from its surroundings. This is not to say such a civilization did exist. It is only to acknowledge something that can feel uncomfortable at first. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, especially on a planet that actively destroys its own past. We tend to think of history as something layered neatly beneath our feet. Older things below, newer things above. But the Earth doesn't keep pages in order. It folds, flips, shatters, and rearranges those layers endlessly. A structure built in one place could be scattered across continents or erased entirely, leaving behind nothing we would recognize as intentional. And when we hear first civilization, our imagination often jumps immediately to advanced technology. Glowing machines, impossible knowledge, tools far beyond our own. That expectation may be a limitation. Civilization does not require metal skyscrapers or digital networks. At its core, it involves sustained social organization, shared knowledge, tools, and an ability to shape the environment intentionally over time. A civilization adapted to a Pangaean world might look nothing like ours. It might rely on materials that do not fossilize well. It might build with organic substances, earthworks, or structures designed to blend back into the landscape. It might leave behind chemical or isotopic signatures rather than recognizable artifacts. Life itself had already proven remarkably inventive long before humans arrived. By the time Pangaea formed, complex multicellular organisms were well established. Forests existed. Large animals walked the land. Ecosystems were intricate and resilient. Intelligence, at least in limited forms, had already appeared in various lineages. Cephalopods today demonstrate problem-solving abilities and memory. Birds and mammals show social complexity and tool use. Intelligence is not a single event. It is a trait that can emerge under many conditions. If an intelligent species had evolved during Pangaea, it would have faced a world very different from ours. With one continuous landmass, migration patterns would be vast. Climate zones would be extreme, with deep continental interiors experiencing intense heat or cold far from the moderating influence of oceans. Deserts could stretch for thousands of miles. Monsoon systems might behave differently. Coastal regions would still exist, but the geometry of currents and winds would shape life in unfamiliar ways. Such a civilization, if it arose, would not know continents drifting apart. From its perspective, the land would feel eternal. Mountains might slowly grow or erode. But the idea that the ground itself could someday split and carry entire cultures away from one another would be beyond imagination. The separation of Pangaea happened slowly over tens of millions of years. No single generation would notice it. Coastlines would creep. Rifts would widen. Shallow seas would form where dry land once lay. Over time, what was once a connected world would become fragmented, isolating populations, altering climates, reshaping ecosystems. If that civilization depended on long-distance travel or shared knowledge across the land, those connections would gradually strain. Journeys that once took weeks might take months or become impossible. Familiar routes could flood or fracture. The world would not end suddenly. It would change quietly, persistently, without ceremony. Adaptation would be required, and not all societies adapt at the same pace or in the same way. And there's something striking here, something that echoes across time. This mirrors patterns we see much later in human history, just on a smaller scale. Civilizations rise in stable climates and decline when conditions shift. Trade networks collapse when geography changes or resources move. Knowledge is lost when connections break. The difference is scale. On a Pangaean Earth, those forces would operate not across regions but across the entire planet. As the land split and oceans widened, populations could become isolated for millions of years. Languages, technologies, and cultures would diverge until they were unrecognizable to one another, assuming any survived at all. Some groups might retreat inland, others might move toward coasts. Some might adapt, others might fade. And over geological timescales, even survival does not guarantee remembrance. The fossil record already tells us life has been reset many times. Mass extinctions have wiped out the majority of species on Earth in relatively short periods. The causes vary: volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, climate collapse, ocean anoxia. In the aftermath, life recovers. But it does not restore what was lost. It invents again. If an early civilization had existed, it would not need to be destroyed by a single dramatic event. It could simply be overtaken by environmental change, fragmented by continental drift, and eventually erased by the same processes that erase mountains. And that brings us to a quiet realization that sits at the center of this entire thought experiment. The Earth does not remember in the way we do. It records pressure, temperature, chemistry, and structure, but not intention. It does not label a stone as a tool or a wall as a home. Over enough time, all of it becomes rock again, folded back into the slow language of geology. What we call history survives only because it is recent. Deep time is not kind to memory. As we continue exploring this idea, it's worth keeping that scale in mind, not to inflate the mystery, but to ground it. The question is not whether such a civilization could hide from us intentionally. It is whether the Earth itself would allow us to find it at all. The surface is temporary. The oceans you cross are temporary. Even the continents beneath your feet are passing through a phase. From here, we can begin to look more closely at what Pangaea itself was like, not as a diagram in a textbook, but as a living world with climates, ecosystems, and rhythms very different from our own. Because understanding the landscape helps us understand what kinds of life could exist there, and what kinds of traces might vanish without a trace. The story doesn't end here, and it doesn't resolve into certainty. It simply moves forward, carried by the slow motion of the planet itself, as we follow it into the shape of a world that no longer exists, but once did. Long before anyone could draw a line on a map, before borders were argued over or named, before even the idea of a continent existed as a separate thing, the Earth offered no clear divisions at all. Land did not come in pieces. It arrived as one vast, uninterrupted expanse, stretching farther than any traveler could reasonably imagine crossing in a single lifetime. There were no edges in the familiar sense, no moments where the ground clearly stopped being one place and became another place, defined somewhere else. The world was continuous, and for anything living on it, that continuity would have shaped every decision, every movement, every way of thinking. To picture this properly, it helps to set aside modern instincts. Today, we're surrounded by boundaries that feel natural, even when we know they're artificial. Countries have borders, regions have names. Continents are separated by oceans so wide that crossing them still feels like a major event, even with modern technology. We grow up absorbing these divisions so thoroughly that it becomes difficult to imagine a world without them. Yet for most of Earth's history, those divisions simply did not exist. There was no sense of Africa drifting away from South America. No idea of Eurasia or Australia or Antarctica as distinct destinations. There was only land stretching on, shaped by climate and terrain rather than invisible lines. In such a world, movement would not be framed as migration between continents. It would simply be travel, Rivers would guide journeys instead of borders. Mountain ranges would be obstacles or landmarks, not political boundaries. Deserts would be regions to cross carefully, not edges of nations. The concept of being from somewhere else would be less about crossing a line and more about distance, how far someone had traveled, how the air smelled different, how the plants changed, how the animals behaved. Identity would be tied to ecosystems rather than territories. A continuous landmass changes how life spreads. When barriers are few, genes flow freely. Species expand their ranges gradually, following favorable conditions. Isolation, when it occurs, comes from climate, altitude, or distance rather than oceans. That has consequences not only for biology, but for culture and knowledge as well. Ideas, tools, and practices would diffuse slowly but steadily across the land, carried by travelers, traders, or wanderers whose journeys might span generations rather than months. If an early civilization arose in such a setting, its sense of the world would be fundamentally different from ours. There would be no reason to imagine the planet as broken into large pieces separated by impossible distances. The Earth would feel whole, even if it was vast beyond comprehension. Stories would not begin with across the sea as something exotic and unreachable. Instead, the unknown would lie beyond the next mountain chain, across the next stretch of unfamiliar forest or arid plain. Without maps as we know them, knowledge of place would be embodied rather than abstract. Directions would be learned through experience, passed on through memory and narrative rather than symbols on paper. Landmarks would matter deeply. A particular bend in a river, a distinctive rock formation, a grove of unusual trees. These would anchor understanding. Over time, such knowledge could become extraordinarily detailed, even if it was never written down. Oral traditions, practical routes, seasonal movements, these could form a mental geography as rich as any modern atlas. Borders do more than divide land. They divide responsibility, identity, and often memory. In their absence, the idea of ownership might look very different. Land could be shared, traversed, revisited through cycles of seasons rather than claimed permanently. This does not mean conflict would be absent. Resources would still be contested. Favorable regions would still attract competition. But conflicts would be shaped by proximity and need, not abstract claims over distant territory. Continents today act as evolutionary and cultural incubators precisely because they are isolated. Australia's wildlife evolved along a path unlike anywhere else because oceans cut it off. The Americas developed independently for millions of years. Africa's long continuity shaped the path of human evolution. In a Pangaean world, those isolations would not exist, or would exist only in limited, shifting forms. This could slow divergence in some ways while accelerating complexity in others. Cultures might borrow freely, adapting ideas rather than reinventing them in isolation. At the same time, the sheer size of the landmass would introduce its own forms of separation. A journey from one side of Pangaea to the other could take generations. Climate zones would vary dramatically. The interior of the supercontinent would be far from the moderating influence of oceans, leading to extreme seasonal swings. Summers could be brutally hot. Winters could be bitterly cold. Entire regions might be inhospitable for long stretches of the year. These conditions could create cultural islands not defined by water, but by heat, cold, or scarcity. This kind of separation is subtle. It doesn't announce itself with a coastline. It creeps in through habit and necessity. People settle where survival is easier. They avoid regions that demand too much. Over time, those choices create gaps in contact. Knowledge may stop flowing smoothly. Practices diverge. Dialects shift. What began as a single continuous cultural fabric could slowly fray into loosely connected threads. Now imagine this process unfolding over millions of years, not thousands. Long before Pangaea began to split, it was already dynamic. Plates pressed together lifting mountains. Others sagged, creating basins. Sea levels rose and fell, flooding shallow areas and retreating again. The land was never static. It breathed on geological timescales, expanding and contracting, reshaping itself without regard for anything living upon it. In this context, the idea of a first civilization becomes less about monumental ruins and more about persistence. Could an intelligent species maintain continuity of knowledge across such immense spans of time and space? Could it adapt to shifting climates and landscapes without the anchors we rely on, written records, stable coastlines, fixed routes? If it did, its achievements might not look like ours at all. They might be embedded in practices, in relationships with the environment, in ways of living that leave little behind once abandoned. We often equate civilization with permanence. Stone buildings, cities that endure for centuries. But permanence is a fragile illusion on a restless planet. Even our most enduring structures are temporary on geological timescales. Given enough time, everything erodes. Mountains flatten, seas swallow coastlines. The idea that civilization must announce itself loudly in order to be real is a bias shaped by our short perspective. A world without continents would also shape how time itself was experienced. Seasonal cycles would still exist, driven by the tilt of Earth's axis. But regional patterns could be broader, less fragmented. Monsoon systems might stretch across enormous distances. Droughts could persist for thousands of miles. Abundance and scarcity would move like slow waves across the land. Planning for the future would require attention not just to local signs, but to distant changes carried by travelers in shifting ecosystems. In such a setting, long-distance awareness would matter. Even without maps, information could travel. Stories of changing conditions far away might influence decisions locally. A drying region hundreds of miles distant could eventually affect migration, trade, or conflict. The sense of the world would be expansive, even if it was not precisely measured. As Pangaea began its slow fragmentation, these patterns would shift again. Rifts would open, shallow seas would intrude. What was once a long overland journey might become a coastal route, then an island chain, then open ocean. Each stage would introduce new forms of separation. Communities that once exchanged goods and ideas directly might find themselves cut off, forced to adapt independently. And the crucial point is that none of this would happen quickly enough to feel dramatic in a single lifetime. There would be no announcement, no moment where the world clearly broke apart. Instead, there would be a gradual accumulation of small changes. A river becomes wider. A lowland floods more often. A familiar route becomes unreliable. Over generations, those inconveniences become barriers. Over longer spans, they become oceans. If an early civilization existed during this transition, it would not perceive itself as living through the splitting of a supercontinent. It would experience a world that slowly became harder to navigate as it once had. Knowledge networks might thin. Shared traditions might diverge. Some groups might thrive in new coastal environments, learning to navigate emerging seas. Others might retreat inland, losing contact with former neighbors. What we are left with millions of years later is a planet that bears no obvious scars labeled, "Here, something intelligent once lived." The scars we do see are geological: rift valleys, passive margins, ocean basins. They tell us about forces far larger than any civilization. They do not preserve the details of daily life, of thought, of social structure. This is why imagining a time before maps, borders, or continents matters. It reminds us that our way of dividing the world is recent, fragile, and deeply contingent on geography that is itself temporary. It opens the possibility that intelligent life could have organized itself around a very different sense of place. One that left few durable markers once the land itself changed shape. When Pangaea is mentioned, it is often treated like a frozen diagram, a puzzle image in textbooks where the continents are neatly snapped together and labeled before being pulled apart again. That version is useful, but it's incomplete. Pangaea was not a static slab of land waiting patiently for tectonic plates to do something interesting. It was a living landscape in constant motion, shaped by forces that operated slowly but relentlessly, experienced by every organism on it as weather, terrain, and survival. To understand what life could be like on such a world, it helps to imagine the planet not from space, but from ground level. Imagine standing somewhere deep in the interior of this immense landmass. The nearest coastline might be thousands of miles away. There is no salty breeze drifting inland, no moderating influence from large bodies of water. The sky above you behaves differently here. Clouds form less readily. Rain is less predictable. Seasons arrive with greater intensity. Summer heat lingers, building day after day, while winters bring cold that settles deeply into the soil and stone. This continental interior would have been a place of extremes. Modern continents already show this pattern on a smaller scale. Central Asia, for example, experiences some of the hottest summers and coldest winters on Earth because it lies far from oceanic influence. Now expand that effect across an entire supercontinent. Vast regions of Pangaea would have been dominated by arid or semi-arid climates, not because the planet was dry overall, but because moisture simply could not travel far enough inland to balance evaporation. Deserts on Pangaea were not small patches between greener regions. They could stretch for immense distances, shaped by global wind patterns circling the supercontinent. And these were not static deserts. Over long periods, they expanded, contracted, shifted position. As climate cycles changed, life adapted accordingly. Plants evolved to conserve water. Animals developed strategies to cope with heat and scarcity. Rivers became lifelines, carving narrow corridors of abundance through otherwise unforgiving terrain. Closer to the edges of Pangaea, the world looked very different. Coastlines wrapped around the supercontinent like a nearly continuous ribbon. Shallow seas flooded low-lying areas, creating broad coastal plains, wetlands, and deltas. These regions were rich in nutrients, fed by sediments washed down from the interior. Life flourished here. Forests could thrive where rainfall was more regular. Marine ecosystems blended into terrestrial ones, creating zones of exceptional productivity. Importantly, these coastlines were not fixed. Sea levels rose and fell over geological time as ice formed and melted at the poles and as tectonic forces reshaped the crust. A coastal settlement, if one existed, might find itself inland after thousands of years, or submerged beneath shallow seas. Over much longer timescales, entire coastal regions could be lost to subduction or buried beneath layers of sediment. Mountains were another defining feature of Pangaea as a living landscape. The formation of the supercontinent involved massive continental collisions events that crumpled the crust and thrust up mountain ranges comparable to, or larger than, today's Himalayas. These mountains were not just scenery. They shaped climate by redirecting winds and creating rain shadows. One side of a range could be lush and wet, while the other remained dry and harsh. Over millions of years, these mountains eroded. Rivers carried their material away, grain by grain, feeding distant plains and seas. What began as towering peaks softened into rolling highlands, then flattened into broad plateaus. Yet even as old mountains wore down, new ones rose elsewhere. Pangaea was a place of constant geological renewal, even if no single generation could perceive it. This dynamic terrain meant habitats were always changing. Forests expanded and retreated. Grasslands emerged where forests once stood. Wetlands dried. New river systems formed as old ones were diverted by tectonic shifts or sediment buildup. Life responded not by remaining fixed, but by moving, adapting, or disappearing. If an intelligent civilization existed in such a setting, it would be shaped as much by these slow changes as by any internal developments. Long-term planning would be constrained by uncertainty. A river that sustained generations might gradually change course. A fertile plain could become less reliable as rainfall patterns shifted. Knowledge of the land would need to be flexible, updated continuously through experience rather than assumed to be permanent. This stands in contrast to how we often picture ancient civilizations anchored to stable features like the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates. Even those rivers have shifted over time, but within limits small enough for written history to track. On Pangaea, many environmental changes would unfold over spans far longer than any written record assuming writing existed at all. Another important aspect of Pangaea as a living landscape is its biological connectivity. With land bridges everywhere and no major ocean barriers, species could spread widely. That doesn't mean the planet was biologically uniform. Climate gradients still created distinct ecosystems, but the potential for exchange was much greater than on today's fragmented continents. For an early civilization, this could have profound implications. Technologies, agricultural practices, or social structures might spread gradually across vast distances adapted locally, but sharing a common ancestry. At the same time, the sheer scale of the landmass would slow communication. News might take generations to travel, carried by chains of contact rather than direct exchange. This creates a world where continuity and fragmentation coexist. Everything is connected in principle, but not necessarily in practice. The land allows movement, but distance imposes limits. Climate allows growth, but variability introduces risk. Civilization, if it arose, would be both unified and diverse, coherent in some respects, wildly varied in others. It's also worth considering the role of fire. Large, dry interiors combined with periodic lightning storms would make wildfires common. Fire shapes ecosystems profoundly. It clears old growth, releases nutrients, opens opportunities for new species. Intelligent life would have to understand and manage fire not just as a tool, but as a recurring force of nature. Volcanism added another layer of dynamism. The assembly and breakup of Pangaea were associated with extensive volcanic activity. Large igneous provinces released vast amounts of lava and gases over relatively short geological periods. These events could alter climate, globally warming, cooling, acidifying oceans. Life endured these episodes, but not without disruption. From the perspective of a civilization living through such times, the changes might appear as hardship without clear cause. Crops fail, weather patterns shift, ecosystems reorganize. Without an understanding of plate tectonics or atmospheric chemistry, explanations would likely be local, symbolic, or practical rather than global. Adaptation would come through trial, error, and memory passed down across generations. One of the most overlooked aspects of Pangaea as a living landscape is time itself. Not clock time, environmental time. Seasons would still cycle annually, but longer rhythms would be subtle. Multi-century droughts, gradual cooling or warming trends, slow encroachment of deserts or forests. Recognizing these patterns requires long-term awareness. Responding to them requires even longer-term strategies. Human societies today struggle with changes unfolding over decades. On Pangaea, the most significant transformations would unfold over thousands or millions of years, far beyond the intuitive grasp of any single individual. A civilization's resilience would depend on whether its knowledge systems could encode and transmit lessons learned across many generations, even as the environment slowly rewrote the context in which those lessons applied. As Pangaea approached the period when it would begin to split, these dynamics intensified. Stresses built in the crust. Rift zones formed. Volcanic activity increased in some regions. The landscape signaled change, but in a language measured in deep time rather than sudden catastrophe. Valleys widened, ground subsided. Shallow seas crept inland along new fractures. Life adapted again. Coastal ecosystems expanded into newly flooded areas. Inland routes were altered. What had once been a continuous land corridor might become marshy, then impossible, then submerged. For any society relying on established pathways, this would be a slow but profound disruption. Seen this way, Pangaea was not simply a backdrop. It was an active participant. It shaped evolution, constrained movement, redistributed resources, and ultimately dismantled the very continuity it had once provided. Any civilization emerging within it would be inseparable from these processes, rising not despite them, but through constant negotiation with them. And this perspective helps explain why we should be cautious about expecting obvious remnants of such a civilization. The living landscape of Pangaea did not preserve things gently. It recycled them. It ground them down, buried them, transformed them. What survives from that era does so largely by accident locked into conditions that protected it from heat, pressure, and time. And so, when people ask whether intelligence could have arisen earlier than we think, the question often hides another assumption beneath it. The assumption that intelligence looks a certain way, behaves a certain way, leaves behind a certain kind of evidence. Usually the evidence we imagine resembles our own: tools, structures, symbols, machines. But intelligence itself is not a single invention, and it is not tied to one biological form. It is a strategy, one of many that life experiments with when conditions allow. On Earth, intelligence has emerged multiple times in different branches of life. It did not wait politely for humans to arrive. Long before our species appeared, evolution was already testing ways to sense, remember, predict, and respond to the environment with flexibility. Brains did not arrive fully formed. They grew slowly, incrementally, shaped by survival pressures that rewarded anticipation and learning. Even today, intelligence does not belong exclusively to animals with large brains or familiar faces. Octopuses solve puzzles, recognize individuals, and plan escapes despite being separated from us by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Birds demonstrate memory, problem solving, even basic tool construction. Mammals exhibit social intelligence, emotional awareness, long-term planning. None of these lineages inherited intelligence from a single ancestor. They arrived at it independently, shaped by their own ecological challenges. And that matters, because it suggests intelligence is not a rare fluke. It is a recurring outcome when certain conditions align. Environmental complexity, long lifespans, flexible bodies or manipulators, selective pressure favoring learning over rigid instinct. Pangaea, as a living, changing world, provided many such conditions across vast stretches of time. The fossil record shows that complex nervous systems existed far earlier than most people realize. By the time Pangaea formed, animals with centralized brains had already evolved. Predators and prey were locked into evolutionary arms races rewarding speed, perception, decision-making. Social behaviors were emerging. Some species coordinated movements, others cared for offspring. These are not trivial steps. They're the foundations upon which more elaborate cognition can build. It's tempting to imagine intelligence as a sudden leap, a moment where something switches on. In reality, it is more like a slope than a step. Slightly better memory leads to better foraging. Better foraging supports longer development. Longer development allows more learning. More learning encourages social interaction. Social interaction drives communication. Communication reshapes cognition. None of this requires a destination, and if intelligence can arise gradually, the next question becomes quieter. Stranger. Could it reach a level of complexity comparable to early human societies long before humans existed? That answer depends less on raw brain size and more on stability. Intelligence thrives when organisms have time to learn, share knowledge, build on previous experience. That requires environments challenging but not constantly catastrophic. Pangaea, despite its extremes, offered long periods of relative stability in many regions. Climate shifted on geological scales, yes, but local environments could remain consistent for millions of years. River systems persisted. Forests expanded and contracted gradually. Coastal zones migrated slowly. For life forms adapted to these conditions, there would be time not just to survive, but to refine behavior across many generations. One objection often raised against early intelligence is energy. Brains are expensive. They consume a great deal of energy relative to their size. Supporting them requires reliable calories. Yet Pangaea supported enormous biomass at various times. Vast forests, extensive coastal wetlands, productive shallow seas. Herbivores grew large. Predators followed. Energy flowed through ecosystems at a scale that could support metabolically demanding adaptations. Another objection is the lack of evidence for technology. But technology is not binary. It does not begin with metal tools in cities. It begins with behavior using objects, modifying environments, exploiting patterns. Many animals today show proto-technological behaviors. Beavers reshape landscapes. Ants farm fungi. Birds weave intricate nests. None of these leave durable artifacts after millions of years. Yet they represent complex, learned interaction with the environment. An early intelligent species might rely heavily on organic materials. Wood, fiber, hide, bone. These decay rapidly under most conditions. Even stone tools, if used sparingly, reshaped frequently, could be mistaken for natural fracture patterns once eroded and redeposited. Over hundreds of millions of years, the odds of preserving a clear, unambiguous signature of intentional manufacture drop dramatically. And there's also the question of motivation. Human civilization is driven in part by surplus. Agriculture creates excess resources, allowing specialization, hierarchy, large-scale construction. But agriculture depends on particular plants, climates, seasonal predictability. An earlier intelligence might follow a different path, one that doesn't emphasize permanent settlements or massive structures. It might be semi-nomadic, moving with environmental cycles rather than forcing rigid control. Knowledge could be carried in memory, ritual, practice rather than external records. Tools might be simple, effective, replaceable. The goal might not be expansion or accumulation, but balance. From our perspective, this could look like lack of progress. From theirs, it might be stability. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that intelligence could rise and fall without ever reaching what we'd call civilization. A lineage might achieve sophisticated cognition, social learning, problem solving, only to be wiped out by environmental change, before it reshaped the planet in a lasting way. Evolution is full of experiments that worked for a time and then ended. Mass extinctions matter here. The Earth has experienced events where a majority of species disappeared in relatively short geological intervals. These reset ecosystems. They remove dominant groups and create opportunities for others. If an intelligent lineage existed before such an event, it might vanish completely, leaving no descendants to carry forward its adaptations. Even without mass extinction, gradual change can erode the conditions that support intelligence. Climate shifts reduce food availability, habitat fragmentation isolates populations, competition favors different strategies. Intelligence is not always the winning move. Sometimes simpler, faster, more reproductively efficient organisms prevail, and it's also worth questioning whether intelligence must be centralized in individuals. Collective intelligence exists. Social insects exhibit complex behavior emerging from simple rules followed by many individuals. While this isn't intelligence in the human sense, it shows problem solving and environmental manipulation can arise without large brains or conscious planning. Over deep time, hybrid strategies could evolve that blur these distinctions. A species with moderate individual intelligence but strong collective memory and coordination. Such a system might leave even fewer recognizable traces, especially if its structures were temporary or organic. Yet it could still shape ecosystems, influence evolutionary trajectories, experience something akin to culture. One of our strongest biases is the idea that intelligence inevitably leads to visible dominance. Humans dominate because our combination of cognition, social structure, and technology aligned in a way that scaled rapidly. That does not mean every intelligent species would follow the same path. Some might avoid overexploitation. Others might lack the social pressures that drive expansion. Some might self-limit intentionally or otherwise. Time complicates everything. Millions of years offer opportunity for intelligence to arise, but they also guarantee profound change. Even if an early civilization lasted 1,000,000 years, an extraordinary span by human standards, it would still be a brief flicker in geological terms. After its disappearance, the Earth would continue to work, eroding surfaces, burying evidence, rearranging continents. When we search for intelligence in the past, we tend to look for ourselves. We look for symmetry, regularity, artifacts that fit our expectations. But an earlier intelligence might be genuinely alien, not because it came from elsewhere, but because it evolved under conditions we have never experienced. Its priorities, technologies, expressions of knowledge could fall outside our categories. This does not mean we should accept speculation without restraint. Science relies on evidence. Extraordinary claims require strong support. But it does mean we should be careful about assuming that absence of familiar evidence rules out unfamiliar possibilities. Deep time isn't just long, it actively destroys most forms of record keeping. Geology preserves some things well, but only under specific circumstances. Rapid burial, low oxygen, minimal disturbance. Even then, what's preserved is biased toward hard parts, simple shapes, chemical signatures resisting alteration. Soft tissues, behaviors, social structures vanish almost entirely. So when we ask whether intelligence could have arisen earlier, the honest answer isn't that it did or didn't, it's that Earth's history allows for the possibility in ways we often underestimate. Life has been complex for a very long time. Nervous systems have experimented with perception and decision-making for hundreds of millions of years. Environments have offered challenge and opportunity across that same span. The question shifts from, could it happen, to, would we recognize it if it had? Recognition depends on assumptions, on what we expect intelligence to leave behind. If those expectations are too narrow, we may be overlooking entire categories of past experience. As the supercontinent began to part, pressures on any existing intelligent systems would increase. Connectivity would decline, environments would shift, isolation would intensify. Whether intelligence survived that transition, transformed itself, or disappeared entirely is something the Earth does not narrate explicitly. It simply continues. And when we picture civilization, most of us still reach for the same images: dense cities, permanent buildings, writing, hierarchy, agriculture, durable tools. Those are descriptions of one path taken by one species, late in Earth's story. If we step back and remove those assumptions, the concept of civilization becomes far more flexible and far less dependent on visible monuments or lasting artifacts. Civilization, at its most basic, is not about stone or metal. It is about coordination. It is shared knowledge persisting beyond a single lifetime. It is systems of behavior that allow a group to survive, adapt, and transmit understanding across generations. Everything else is optional. On a Pangaean Earth with no oceans dividing the world, but with geography itself shifting over deep time permanence, would be a risky strategy. Building to last centuries might offer little advantage if rivers move, climates drift, coastlines creep. In such a setting, flexibility would matter more than durability. Knowledge that could move easily, adapt quickly, and live inside minds rather than walls would be more valuable than anything carved into stone. A civilization shaped by those conditions might look almost invisible to us. Its cities could be seasonal gathering places rather than permanent settlements. Its infrastructure might be routes, signals, and environmental markers rather than roads. Its most important technologies might be social rather than mechanical, ways of organizing labor, resolving conflict, sharing resources, teaching skills efficiently. Even without agriculture, surplus could still exist. Seasonal abundance, managed landscapes, cooperative harvesting providing reliability without fields or fences. Modern hunter-gatherer societies already show complex social structure, trade networks, and rich cultural tradition without farming or permanent architecture. Scale that across a vast continuous landmass and extend it into deep time, and you get something sophisticated yet materially light. Communication in such a civilization would rely on memory, repetition, ritual. Stories wouldn't be entertainment alone. They'd be storage devices, navigation instructions, ecological knowledge, social rules, historical memory embedded in narrative, song, practice. These forms can be resilient when actively maintained, but they leave almost nothing behind once the chain of transmission breaks. We equate writing with civilization because writing matters to us. But writing is only one solution to the problem of memory. It tends to arise when societies become sedentary and administratively complex. A civilization that remains mobile, adaptable, tightly integrated with the environment might never develop writing because it does not need to. Its knowledge would live in people. Technology would look different too. Rather than accumulating layers of specialized tools, it might favor multi-purpose, easily replaced implements. Organic materials would dominate. Wood, fiber, resin, bone, hide. Versatile, effective, and quick to disappear. Even stone, used opportunistically, might not stand out after enough time. Energy use would differ. Without fossil fuels or large-scale metallurgy, energy comes from muscle, fire, wind, water, biological processes. Mastery of fire alone enables cooking, landscape management, tool making, social cohesion. Fire leaves traces, but subtle ones, easily erased over millions of years, especially in dynamic environments shaped by erosion and sedimentation. Social organization might not resemble kingdoms or empires. Rigid hierarchies can be fragile in changing environments. Authority might be situational based on expertise rather than position. Leadership shifting depending on hunting, navigation, conflict resolution, ecological knowledge. Such systems can be highly effective without producing centralized power structures that leave obvious physical signatures. Trade networks could span enormous distances without formal infrastructure. Objects, ideas, practices moving slowly from group to group, changing as they go. Shared cultural threads without uniformity. From our perspective, this might look like simple diffusion, yet it could be a sophisticated system of exchange. Another assumption worth questioning is expansion. Human history emphasizes growth, accumulation, control. But these aren't inevitable traits of intelligence. In a world as vast as Pangaea, expansion might offer diminishing returns. Unknown regions could mean harsher climates, different hazards. Stability might come from staying within known limits rather than pushing outward. If an early civilization followed that strategy, its footprint would remain light. It might avoid overexploiting resources not out of ideology, but because restraint ensures survival. From a geological perspective, that restraint makes it almost invisible. Time perception would also differ. Without clocks or rigid calendars, time is cycles. Seasons, migrations, flowering, animal behavior. Long-term change, noticed gradually, embedded in collective memory rather than measured precisely. Learning would be continuous, contextual, embodied. skills acquired through participation rather than instruction, efficient, adaptable, and again, leaving no durable artifact once practitioners are gone. Conflict might be localized. Without fixed assets, less incentive for large destructive wars that create fortifications, mass graves, stockpiles. Not utopia, just different pressures, different outputs. Belief systems would be shaped by impermanence, cosmologies emphasizing cycles, change, adaptation. The shifting Earth understood as alive in a practical sense, not metaphor, but daily observation. One of the hardest ideas to accept is that a civilization could be advanced without being extractive. Modern progress is tied to large-scale alteration, roads, mines, dams, cities, waste. But intelligence doesn't require domination. It requires understanding. A civilization prioritizing understanding over control might avoid actions leaving long-lasting scars, especially if scars threaten future survival. So the absence of ruins isn't necessarily a mystery. Ruins are byproducts of particular choices. Different choices create different legacies. It's also possible such a civilization would leave traces we don't yet know how to interpret. Subtle ecosystem alterations, species distributions influenced by intentional movement, genetic signatures of selective breeding, chemical anomalies suggesting controlled fire use, signals difficult to distinguish from natural processes, especially after hundreds of millions of years. Modern archaeology is tuned to recent time. It can find stone tools tens of thousands of years old, structures thousands of years old. It struggles to detect behavioral complexity in deep time, especially when behavior doesn't rely on durable materials. If civilization without our assumptions existed, it would challenge not just our picture of the past, but our definition of progress. It would suggest intelligence can choose paths other than accumulation and permanence. It would imply survival over deep time may favor adaptability and restraint over expansion and monument building. As continents began to separate, pressures would mount, roots would break, contacts weaken, environmental zones fragment. Some groups adapt to new coastlines, others remain inland. Shared knowledge diverges until it's not shared at all. What began coherent dissolves into isolated traditions, then fades as conditions continue shifting. Millions of years later, we see none of this directly. We see rifts, we see fossils, we see chemical signatures of ancient climates. But the decision-making, the social coordination, the understanding guiding lives across a unified world gone without a trace. Thinking this way doesn't require believing such a civilization definitely existed. It requires acknowledging that our criteria for recognizing civilization are narrow shaped by our own experience, not by the full range of possibilities life might explore. When those criteria loosen, the deep past becomes less empty. Not because we fill it with fantasies, but because we recognize how little we can reasonably expect to find. And when people imagine clues to an ancient civilization, they often picture something obvious waiting to be uncovered. A carved wall, a buried city, a tool so unmistakable, no natural process could explain it. That expectation makes sense for recent history when time has not yet ground everything down. But in the depths of geological time, clear evidence is unrealistic. What remains is not a carefully kept record. It's a patchwork of survivors, fragments, and absences. The clues, if they exist, would be quiet, indirect, easy to overlook. Stone is treated as the most reliable witness because it endures. But even stone is not permanent. It fractures, dissolves, recrystallizes, melts. Over millions of years, it is folded deep into the earth, transformed under pressure and heat, returned to the surface altered. Even mountains vanish on geological timescales. If mountain ranges can disappear, smaller constructions have little chance of remaining recognizable. That doesn't mean stone holds no information. It just means the information is encoded differently. Not in shapes and surfaces, but in chemistry, layering, stress patterns read with instruments and context. Subtle anomalies can hint at unusual past conditions, rapid deposition where slow accumulation is expected, repeated disturbance in layers that should be stable, materials appearing together that usually do not form in the same environments. None of these scream civilization, but they suggest interruption. Fossils present a similar challenge. Fossilization is rare. Most organisms never fossilize. Soft-bodied creatures vanish almost entirely. Even among those with hard parts, only a tiny fraction are preserved and fewer still are found. The fossil record is not a complete archive, it's a biased sample shaped by chance. If an early civilization relied on organic materials, its members would leave few direct traces. Bodies might fossilize under rare circumstances, but intelligence itself does not fossilize. Behavior does not fossilize. Social organization does not fossilize. At best, we might see indirect signs patterns suggesting more than instinct. Controlled fire use leaves traces, but those traces are subtle. Charcoal layers indicate burning, but separating wildfires from repeated intentional fire use is difficult. Over millions of years, charcoal erodes, redeposits, alters chemically. Even patterns blend into background noise on a planet where fire is natural. Tool use could be a clue, but signals fade quickly. Stone tools are identifiable in young sediments because intentional flaking patterns remain and context is preserved. Push them back hundreds of millions of years, subject them to tectonics, erosion, redeposition, and patterns blur. Edges wear down. Context disappears. A tool becomes just another oddly shaped rock in a chaotic deposit. Then there are gaps. Absences can be data, sudden shifts in species distributions, unexpected disappearances not clearly tied to climate or volcanism, ecosystems reorganizing without an obvious trigger. Gaps invite explanation, though they don't provide it. Consider how human activity looks in the geological record today. Plastics, altered sedimentation, unusual chemical signatures, rapid changes in species abundance. Even these dramatic signals would fade over millions of years. Plastics break down, cities erode, chemical anomalies diffuse. Future geologists might detect only a brief, puzzling layer of disruption. Scale that backward to a civilization less industrial, more integrated, and its signature becomes fainter still. It might show as slightly accelerated spread of certain species, moved intentionally. Repeated landscape modification mimicking natural processes. Statistical oddities noticeable only in massive data sets. Mineral deposits are another quiet possibility. Certain minerals form only under specific conditions. If they appear out of place, questions arise. But geology offers many natural explanations: heat, pressure, volcanic chemistry, rare environmental circumstances. Invoking intelligence requires ruling out all of those hard to do even in recent time, harder in deep time. Isotopic signatures can reveal past temperatures, atmospheric composition, biological activity. Shifts indicate changes in carbon, oxygen, nitrogen cycling. Life alters these cycles. Widespread coordinated activity by intelligent organisms could in theory leave a detectable imprint. But disentangling that from natural evolution is extraordinarily difficult. The most intriguing clues may not be objects at all, but patterns. Patterns in extinction and survival, patterns in evolutionary bursts, patterns in recovery after disruption. If intelligence influenced ecosystems, it might change these patterns subtly without leaving obvious artifacts. But pattern recognition depends on interpretation, and interpretation admits multiple explanations. Science favors known processes over speculative ones when evidence is ambiguous. And here, we run into our own limitations. The deep past isn't just missing artifacts, it's missing context. We don't always know what questions to ask, because our questions are shaped by our lives. We look for cities because we live in cities. We look for writing because writing anchors our memory. We look for tools that resemble ours. An earlier intelligence might prioritize things we don't measure. Distributed decision-making. Long-term environmental management encoded in cultural norms. Communication through sound, gesture, chemical signals. These aren't science fiction. They exist among modern organisms. Scaled and refined over millions of years, they could support complex societies with minimal material output. One of the quietest clues is simply longevity. Complex life has existed for over 500 million years. That is a long time for evolution to explore possibilities. Humans often feel inevitable, but evolution has no foresight. It tries many paths. Most end. Some persist for long spans without leading to industrial civilization. If intelligence arose earlier and vanished, it would not need a dramatic marker. It could fade with changing conditions, loss of connectivity, environments shifting beyond adaptive range. In the fossil record, that looks like normal turnover, not a mystery. And that is uncomfortable because it suggests limits to what we can know. Science thrives on evidence, but Earth's memory is selective. Deep time is an aggressive editor. Entire chapters may be reduced to footnotes or erased, not because they were unimportant, but because the medium could not preserve them. Acknowledging this doesn't weaken science. It strengthens it by clarifying boundaries. Certainty decreases as we move further back, not because the past was more chaotic, but because signals grow quieter. Listening requires humility as much as ingenuity. As methods improve, new clues may emerge. Large-scale statistical analyses of geological data, better models of ancient ecosystems, new understanding of how intelligent behavior could influence environments without dominating them. These won't reveal a lost civilization neatly, but they might refine what is plausible. For now, the clues remain quiet. They sit in folded stone, in fossils representing a fraction of what once lived, in gaps where something might have been or might not. They don't point clearly. They remind us Earth's past is deeper and more complex than the narrow slice we usually examine. From this perspective, the question is not whether we missed something obvious. It's whether we are prepared to recognize subtlety when it appears. Because if intelligence once moved through a world without borders, building systems without monuments, and knowledge without records, the traces it left behind would not announce themselves loudly. They would blend into the background of a planet that has always been very good at keeping its secrets, even as it continues, without pause, into whatever comes next. At some point, without drama and without any clear signal that could be understood within a single lifetime, the ground itself began to behave differently. Not suddenly, not violently, at first. More like a slow insistence. The kind of pressure that builds so gradually you don't notice it until you realize the shape of what you've been standing on has changed. The breakup of Pangaea did not begin as catastrophe. It began as tension. Deep beneath the surface, heat accumulated. The mantle stirred. Convection currents shifted their slow patterns, and the enormous plates riding above them responded not with sharp breaks, but with gradual strain. Like thick clay pulled gently from opposite ends. The supercontinent did not crack immediately. From the perspective of anything living on the surface, the world still felt whole. Rivers still flowed, forests still grew, animals still followed familiar paths. If an intelligent civilization existed at this time, its members would not wake up one morning to find the land tearing open beneath their feet. There would be no announcement that the age of unity was ending. Instead, there would be small changes, scattered, inconsistent, easy to explain away. In some regions, the ground might begin to sink slightly. Valleys would deepen where they had once been shallow. Lakes could form where drainage patterns subtly shifted. Elsewhere, volcanic activity might increase, not in one grand explosion, but as persistent eruptions along long linear zones. Lava would seep, spread, cool, harden. Layer upon layer of new rock would be added to the surface. These features are familiar to geologists now. Rift valleys, flood basalts, stretched crust. But to anything living through them, they would simply be part of the landscape's slow evolution. A place that had always been dry becomes wetter. A region known for stability becomes unpredictable. Travel routes grow longer as terrain roughens. None of this points clearly to a planet-scale transformation. It feels local, manageable, temporary. Rifting does not happen evenly. Stress concentrates along weak zones in the crust, often where ancient structures already exist. These zones become lines of vulnerability, places where the Earth prefers to give way. Over time, they lengthen, connect, deepen. What begins as a series of disconnected basins slowly organizes into a coherent system. As this unfolds, the crust thins further. Magma rises more easily. Heat escapes more efficiently. The land stretches beyond its ability to recover. And eventually, inevitably, water finds its way in. A shallow sea floods the rift, and with it, the first true physical separation begins. But even this moment is deceptive. The sea does not arrive as an ocean. It creeps. It forms narrow gulfs and shallow bays. For generations, it might advance and retreat with changing sea levels. Crossing it might still be possible at certain times or in certain places. The sense of separation is incomplete. For a civilization that had grown accustomed to a connected world, these changes would introduce friction rather than finality. Communication between regions would slow. Journeys would require new skills. Boats, if they existed, would need to adapt to salt water rather than rivers or lakes. Knowledge that once traveled easily would now depend on fewer, more fragile pathways. And importantly, this separation would not affect all regions equally. Some parts of Pangaea would remain firmly connected for tens of millions of years after rifting began elsewhere. The supercontinent didn't split neatly down the middle. It fragmented asymmetrically, creating a patchwork of connected and semi-isolated zones. This unevenness matters. It means that any existing social or cultural systems would fracture in stages. Some groups would experience isolation early. Others would remain part of a larger network much longer. The result would not be a single moment of collapse, but a prolonged process of differentiation. Environmental consequences would compound these effects as rifts widened and seas formed. Global circulation patterns changed. Ocean currents reorganized. Atmospheric circulation shifted. Regions that once received regular rainfall might dry out. Others could become wetter. Temperature gradients altered. Over long spans, these changes reshaped ecosystems. An intelligent civilization adapted to earlier conditions would now face choices. Remain where resources decline, leaning on memory and tradition, or move toward newly favorable areas, accepting uncertainty and risk. Neither choice guarantees survival. Adaptation requires not just flexibility, but foresight. And foresight is difficult when change unfolds slowly, yet persistently. The ground pulling itself apart also introduces new hazards. Earthquakes become more common along rift zones. Volcanic gases alter air quality. Ashfall affects vegetation. None of these are necessarily world-ending, but their cumulative impact strains societies, especially those finely tuned to previous conditions. From our perspective, these processes are understood. We have models, timelines, reconstructions, but it's easy to underestimate how disorienting gradual change is from within. Humans today struggle to respond to climate shifts that unfold over decades. A civilization without modern measurement tools, facing changes over centuries or millennia, would experience them as persistent background instability rather than a clear trend. As connections weaken, cultural divergence accelerates. Shared practices adapt to local conditions, language shifts, techniques evolve independently. Even if a common origin remains in collective memory, practical differences grow. What works in one region no longer works in another. Over time, mutual understanding erodes. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a consequence of scale. Large connected systems require maintenance. They rely on regular exchange, shared reference points, synchronized knowledge. When geography undermines those mechanisms, fragmentation becomes the default. The breaking of Pangaea also alters the biological context in which civilization exists. As landmasses separate, species distributions shift. Populations become isolated and diverge. Others migrate along new coastlines. Food webs reorganize. Resources once predictable become variable. For any society dependent on the environment, these changes demand continual adjustment. Strategies that once ensured stability become liabilities. Practices embedded in tradition might resist change until adaptation becomes urgent, perhaps too late. From the geological record, we know the breakup of Pangaea coincided with significant biological turnover. Not as dramatic as the great mass extinctions, perhaps, but still a period where dominant groups shifted and new lineages rose. Environmental stress favors adaptability. It also eliminates those unable to respond. If an early civilization existed, it would be subject to the same pressure. Intelligence does not grant immunity, it only provides tools. And those tools are constrained by available resources, social structure, and accumulated knowledge. One of the most subtle consequences of continental breakup is the loss of redundancy. In a connected world, failure in one region can be compensated by support from another. Resources can be shared. Knowledge can be redistributed. When connections break, local failures become more dangerous. A drought, disease, ecological collapse that might once have been survivable becomes catastrophic in isolation. Over long spans, this leads to attrition. Some groups adapt successfully, others dwindle, some disappear. From the outside, it looks like normal turnover. From the inside, it feels like the slow narrowing of options. Meanwhile, the Earth continues without pause. Rifts widen into oceans. New crust forms at spreading centers. Old crust sinks elsewhere. The planet moves on to a new configuration indifferent to what once depended on the old one. What remains millions of years later is a transformed world. Separate continents, distinct ecosystems, new evolutionary trajectories. The unity of Pangaea becomes a reconstruction inferred from matching coastlines and shared rock formations. Any civilization that arose during the Age of Unity would now be scattered across fragments of that world, if it survived at all. Its story would not be written in ruins. It would be dissolved into geology. Its end would not be marked by a line in stone, but by gradual disconnection, adaptation, and loss. This way of ending is quiet. It does not resemble the dramatic collapses we imagine when we think of civilization. There is no single cause, no final battle, no moment of disappearance. There is only change accumulating until the system that once worked no longer functions as a whole. Understanding this reframes what collapse can mean. It suggests civilizations can fade not because they fail, but because the context supporting them no longer exists. The ground does not need to open dramatically. It only needs to keep moving patiently until the world becomes something else entirely. To live in a world that is slowly tearing itself apart is to inhabit a reality where nothing feels urgent, yet nothing truly stays the same. There is no day that becomes legend as the beginning of the end. Instead, there is a long stretch of ordinary life threaded through small disruptions, each manageable on its own, but together, changing everything. For those living on Pangaea, daily existence would still revolve around familiar needs. Finding food, maintaining shelter, raising offspring, sharing knowledge. The sun would rise and set as it always had. Seasons would still cycle. Animals would migrate. Plants would bloom and wither. On the scale of a lifetime or many lifetimes, the Earth would appear mostly stable. That illusion of stability is exactly what makes slow planetary change so powerful. At first, the signs would be local. A river behaves differently than it used to. Floods become more frequent in one region while another begins to dry. The ground trembles now and then, not violently, but enough to be noticed. Volcanic vents appear where none were remembered. Some routes become difficult to traverse, while others open in new ways. Each change can be explained without invoking a global transformation. Communities normalize gradual change. They adapt. Paths are rerouted. Seasonal movements adjust. Knowledge updates. Oral histories begin to include references to places that used to be different. Elders speak of landscapes remembered from youth that no longer exist in the same form. None of this feels apocalyptic. It feels like the same old work of staying alive. Yet beneath these adjustments, something more profound is happening. The connective tissue of the world is weakening. Routes that once linked distant regions become longer, more hazardous, less reliable. Journeys that once took weeks begin to take months, or stop being possible at all in certain seasons. Communication slows not because people forget how to speak, but because reaching one another becomes harder. For any civilization, connection is not luxury. It is stabilizer. Shared knowledge prevents local failures from becoming permanent losses. Techniques refined in one region can spread. Bonds across distance reduce the impact of local disaster. When those connections thin, vulnerability increases, even if intelligence remains. Living through this thinning would feel subtle at first. Fewer visitors arrive from far regions. News takes longer. Customs diverge slightly. Words shift. Practices once shared become local. None of this is inherently negative. Diversity increases. Local solutions flourish. But something is lost too. The sense of belonging to a single, continuous world. Environmental change reinforces fragmentation. As rifts widen and seas intrude, weather patterns shift. Regions that once shared similar climates begin to diverge. Rainfall increases in some areas, decreases in others. Temperature patterns alter. Ecosystems reorganize, favoring different species. Food sources change, sometimes unpredictably. The challenge becomes cognitive as well as physical. Intelligent beings respond well to immediate threats. We struggle with slow directional change. When conditions worsen gradually, it's easy to believe the next season will return to normal. Hope becomes coping strategy and trap. Adaptation requires recognizing when old assumptions no longer hold. If agriculture existed, cycles might fail. If foraging routes were relied upon, they might become unreliable. Water sources might disappear or turn saline. These shifts force difficult decisions. Stay and adjust, or move, risking the unknown. Each choice carries cost. Neither guarantees success. Mobility. Once advantage becomes more complex as geography fragments. Crossing newly formed seas requires tools, skill, new kinds of trust. Not all communities make that transition. Those who do become coastal specialists. Others retreat inland and lose contact entirely. Psychologically, living through this changes how place is experienced. Land that once felt permanent becomes uncertain. Sacred sites may submerge or become unreachable. Ancestral roots disappear. Identity tied to landscapes must be renegotiated. That destabilizes continuity. And yet, new opportunities appear. Coastlines create rich ecological zones. Shallow seas teem with life. Resources emerge. Societies that adapt quickly may thrive. Change is not uniformly destructive. It redistributes advantage, often unpredictably. Redistribution breeds inequality. Regions favored by new conditions gain resilience. Others become marginal. Support from distant allies is no longer assured. Local failures become more consequential. A prolonged drought, disease, loss of key species. Any of these can push a community past its ability to recover. Over generations, pressures shape culture. Norms may shift toward caution, flexibility, short-term planning. Long projects become risky when the future environment is uncertain. Monumental construction, if it existed, becomes less attractive. Knowledge systems emphasize adaptability over preservation. Memory itself changes. Stories of the old world become less concrete, more symbolic. Children grow up knowing fragments of what once was. Over time, the idea of a unified landmass may feel mythical rather than historical. Lived experience becomes legend, then fades. And none of this requires catastrophe. It requires only enough disruption to break continuity. Civilization, if defined as a sustained system of shared knowledge and coordination, depends on continuity. When continuity breaks, civilization fragments, even if intelligence remains. This fragmentation does not imply sudden end. Life continues. People think, learn, adapt. But the scale of coordination shrinks. What was once global becomes regional. What was regional becomes local. What was shared becomes particular. From a geological perspective, it's unremarkable. From within, it's transformative. It reshapes how beings relate to one another and the world they inhabit. As oceans widen and continents drift farther apart, isolation deepens. Divergence accelerates, not just biologically, but culturally. Practices that work in one environment fail in another. Even the possibility of reconnection diminishes as distances grow. The knowledge required to cross them is lost or never developed. What remains are pockets of adaptation tuned to local conditions, unaware of the larger history that once connected them. Millions of years later, from the outside, it looks like ordinary turnover. Species appear and disappear. Ecosystems shift. Continents separate. There is no obvious marker of a civilization that lived through the transition. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of slow planetary change. It does not erase intelligence. It erases memory. It does not destroy life outright. It dissolves context. Without context, achievements become meaningless, indistinguishable from the background. Movement did not begin as crisis. Long before the planet began to pull itself apart in earnest, life on Pangaea was already in motion. Animals followed seasons, plants spread, rivers carried seeds and nutrients. Travel, in this sense, was normal. What changed during the slow breakup was not movement itself, but its meaning. Migration stopped being merely cyclical. It became directional. Not overnight, not in a way anyone could label at the time, but gradually, as familiar routes grew unreliable and stable regions demanded more effort to sustain life. For intelligent beings, movement begins to carry weight. It shapes survival, memory, identity in ways not required before. At first, migrations look ordinary. A group shifts seasonal range slightly farther. Another stays longer near a river, now more reliable. Small practical decisions accumulate. Over generations, patterns change. Areas once lightly occupied become hubs. Other regions thin. The land begins to feel uneven. Not because it changed suddenly, but because its reliability did. As rift zones widen and shallow seas creep inland, traditional overland routes become marshy, then impassable. Lands that once connected distant regions become barriers rather than corridors. Travelers detour, journeys lengthen, risk increases. Information, once flowing steadily, begins to lag. That lag matters. Environmental warnings arrive too late. Techniques developed elsewhere fail to spread. Adaptation localizes. Intelligence thrives on exchange. Now it operates in smaller circles. Migration becomes more than following resources. It becomes strategy for preserving continuity. Groups that move successfully carry accumulated understanding with them, skills, practices, social structures. Each migration tests whether knowledge forged in one environment can survive another. Crossing newly formed water introduces a new threshold. Even narrow seas change everything. Water demands tools, skills, abstract navigation. Landmarks vanish beyond horizon. At first, the change is partial. A land bridge floods seasonally. A coastal route becomes unreliable. Crossings remain possible with planning and luck. These moments favor experimentation. Rafts, boats, coastal hopping. Some groups adapt, others avoid and turn inward. As seas widen further, adaptation becomes specialization. Those who cross develop distinct skills and identities. Coastal knowledge becomes central: currents, tides, winds, stars. Meanwhile, inland groups lose familiarity with the sea. Water becomes an edge, not corridor. This divergence reshapes civilization more deeply than climate alone. Land routes allow gradual exchange. Water enforces thresholds. Either you cross or you cannot. Once threshold hardens, reconnection becomes rare, then impossible. And here, divergence between movers and stayers deepens. Some adapt in place, refining strategies. Others move, accepting uncertainty. Neither is superior. Both have costs. Staying preserves familiarity but risks entrapment. Moving opens possibility but threatens continuity. Geography amplifies these dynamics. Some regions become funnels. Others become dead ends. Access to emerging coastlines, navigable waters, fertile new zones confers advantage. Isolation becomes liability. Migration is not always voluntary. Flooding, salinization, loss of prey, vegetation shifts. These force movement even when culture urges staying. Forced migration disrupts social structure. Elders lose authority when experience no longer applies. Traditions tied to specific landscapes lose relevance. Knowledge transmission falters when environment that gave it meaning disappears. As migrations accumulate, shared past erodes. Different groups remember different origins. Stories diverge. A unified narrative becomes localized histories. Over time, even the idea of belonging to a larger whole can vanish. From the outside, millions of years later, it appears as dispersion. Species ranges shift, populations spread. Nothing about that suggests intention. And that is the problem. Intelligent migration leaves no clear geological signature. Even human migrations leave little once structures erode. What remains are genetic patterns and cultural echoes. Both blur over deep time. For a Pangaean civilization, routes would later be submerged, uplifted, erased. Sediments recording journeys would be scattered, compressed, transformed. Evidence fragments beyond recognition. Genetic signals persist longer, but not forever. Lineages diverge, mutations accumulate, extinctions prune branches. Eventually, ancestry becomes statistical, not traceable. The story dissolves. Migration also changes how intelligence expresses itself. Mobile societies prioritize navigation, memory, adaptability, social coordination. Accumulation becomes less practical. Knowledge becomes lighter, portable, flexible. And the more mobile and adaptable a civilization becomes, the fewer durable traces it leaves behind. Success becomes persistence, not imprint. As breakup continues, migration corridors narrow further. Oceans widen, crossing points disappear. Movement across land becomes movement along coasts, then across water, then not at all. At each stage, fewer groups make the transition. those who do become isolated from origins. Eventually, migration reaches its limit. Distances too great. Risks too high. Knowledge to cross vast oceans without instruments is lost or never developed. Populations settle into fragments of the former whole now drifting continents. At that point, any civilization that once spanned Pangaea exists only as disconnected remnants, if at all. Shared systems collapse not because intelligence fails, but because geography no longer supports them. What remains are local adaptations, unaware of broader history. This challenges the assumption that migration always spreads civilization. Under certain conditions, migration preserves intelligence short-term, but erodes it at scale. Without sustained connectivity, complex systems fragment. Complexity simplifies not because inferior, but because it cannot be maintained. The first migrations across a breaking planet are testament to adaptability and prelude to loss. The planet does not forbid intelligence. It simply refuses to hold still long enough for it to remain unified. What survives, when the land itself refuses to stay in one piece, is not stone, not towers, not even names. What survives, if anything survives at all, is pattern. Ways of doing. Ways of noticing. Ways of passing something forward long enough for it to matter. Knowledge does not exist on its own. It lives inside relationships, inside routines, habits, shared expectations. It travels along the same pathways that bodies travel, and when pathways weaken, knowledge begins to behave differently. It doesn't vanish all at once. It thins. In a unified landmass, knowledge has reach. It moves outward from its points of origin, carried by travelers and exchanged through cooperation, refined through comparison. A solution discovered in one region can migrate slowly across thousands of miles, adapting as it goes, tested against different climates, different soils, different seasons. Memory, in that context, is collective. No single group has to remember everything, because the wider system carries redundancy. If something is forgotten in one place, it may still exist elsewhere and return through contact. Continental drift undermines that redundancy in a way that is almost invisible at first. Routes lengthen. Travel becomes seasonal rather than routine. Encounters grow less frequent. Knowledge still moves, but it moves more slowly and with more distortion. Each transfer becomes an opportunity for misunderstanding, simplification, or loss. Over generations, these small degradations accumulate. Memory behaves differently depending on how it is stored. Written records, if they exist, are fragile over deep time but robust over shorter spans. Oral traditions are remarkably resilient when actively maintained, but vulnerable to interruption. And practices embedded in daily life persist only as long as the conditions that make them useful remain in place. When environments change, the practices that fit them lose relevance and they're abandoned, often without ceremony, without debate. Not because people become less intelligent, because intelligence is selective. Time and attention are spent on what produces results. When a practice stops working, it stops being taught. In a world breaking apart, this happens repeatedly. A hunting method refined across centuries becomes unreliable when prey species shift. A river-based knowledge system loses meaning when the river changes course. Navigation by landmarks fails when the landscape is reshaped or flooded. Agricultural rhythms, if they exist, lose their timing as rainfall patterns drift. When knowledge stops yielding survival, memory does not preserve it out of respect. It sheds it. This creates a paradox. The more rapidly the world changes, the less capacity a society has to preserve long-term memory. Adaptation crowds out remembrance. Innovation replaces tradition. What remains of the past becomes compressed into simplified narratives, stripped of technical detail and held mostly as symbol. Culture follows the same trajectory. In a connected world, culture layers itself. New elements accumulate on older ones. Differences exist, but shared reference points remain. Under increasing separation, culture fragments. Isolation accelerates divergence. Shared rituals evolve independently. Languages shift. Meanings drift. After enough time, mutual intelligibility disappears. This does not require conflict. It arises naturally from distance. Even groups that begin with identical practices will diverge when exposed to different constraints. The drift is gradual, but it is relentless. And it is not just language and ritual. It is assumption. It is what a society expects the world to do. In one region, seasonal rain remains reliable, and planning becomes structured around predictability. In another, rainfall becomes erratic, and planning becomes opportunistic. These differences shape personality at the cultural level. A people raised in stability learns to invest. A people raised in volatility learns to move. Neither is superior. Both are responses. And once those responses become normal, they are hard to translate. Knowledge transmission also depends on trust. Information from distant sources must be evaluated. In a connected world, repeated interaction builds reliability. In a world where encounters become rare, unfamiliar practices are more likely to be rejected. Local solutions feel safer. External ideas lose authority. This slows the movement of knowledge even further. Memory at scale collapses into memory at home. Each group remembers its own history framed by its own landscape. Stories of distant origins become abstract, then mythic, then irrelevant. Eventually, the idea that these groups were once part of a larger whole may vanish entirely, not because it is forbidden, but because it stops meaning anything in practice. From a geological perspective, this leaves nothing. No layer records the moment a shared tradition diverged into many. No fossil preserves the abandonment of a navigational method. No rock captures the end of a seasonal gathering that once carried news across an entire world. These changes are real, but they are behavior. They are the most fragile kind of record. Even in human history, within mere centuries, knowledge disappears. Techniques die. Languages vanish. Entire ways of understanding the world dissolve. Multiply that fragility by millions of years, and expecting anything recognizable to remain becomes unreasonable. Continental drift also alters the rhythm of innovation. In a unified world, innovation spreads like ripples. In a fragmented world, innovation becomes punctuated. Breakthroughs happen locally, then stall. Parallel solutions appear independently, similar but not shared. Over time, this creates the illusion of separate origin even when ideas once had common ancestry. This is important because it means that even if we did find something echoing intelligence in deep time, some pattern in sediment, some strange recurrence in ecological change, it would not necessarily mean a single civilization. It could mean convergent adaptation under similar pressures. Without continuous transmission, origin becomes ambiguous, and memory systems themselves evolve under these pressures. Societies living under instability may prioritize short-term knowledge over long-term accumulation. Planning horizons shrink. Cultural emphasis shifts toward flexibility rather than preservation. In such contexts, memory becomes dynamic rather than archival. If an early civilization existed during the breakup of Pangaea, its most sophisticated achievements might not have been material at all. They might have been cognitive, social systems for rapid learning, methods for integrating newcomers, structures that allow change without tearing a society apart. These achievements would leave no physical trace, yet they could determine survival. As isolation deepens, even these systems strain. Smaller populations carry less collective memory. Losses become harder to replace. Innovation slows not because intelligence declines, but because the pool of experience shrinks. Over time, complexity can simplify. This simplification should not be mistaken for failure. It is response to constraint. Maintaining complexity requires energy, stability, redundancy. When those conditions disappear, complexity becomes liability. Simplification preserves function. From the outside, it may look like decline. From within, it is the only way to continue. Knowledge is not lost all at once. It is shed deliberately, piece by piece, as circumstances demand. And the slow nature of continental drift ensures that this shedding feels natural. No one decides to forget. No one announces the end of an era. The world simply stops rewarding certain forms of understanding and attention moves elsewhere. Eventually, what remains of any once shared civilization is distributed across separated continents as unrelated traditions. Each believes itself complete. None remembers the whole. Intelligence persists, but scale is reduced. This may be the most sobering implication of deep time. Not that civilizations must fall, but that continuity is fragile. It depends not only on intelligence, but on geography's willingness to cooperate. When the planet withdraws that cooperation, memory fractures along with the land. And then the oceans do what they always do. They widen, they deepen, they erase. Long after the first fractures appear, long after shallow seas creep into low valleys and turn familiar routes into uncertain crossings, water begins to behave not as a boundary with edges, but as distance with no anchor. We talk about roads as if they must be constructed stone-laid, paths engineered, bridges built. But routes exist even without architecture. Repeated movement creates pathways. Trails appear where feet pass often. River corridors become highways. Seasonal circuits form predictable loops. These are roads in every practical sense, even if they leave no stone behind. They exist as habit carved into the landscape, reinforced by memory. Oceans are uniquely effective at destroying such systems. Unlike forests that can be cut through again, deserts that can be crossed with preparation, open water severs continuity once it reaches sufficient width. A route that once required endurance suddenly requires an entirely different kind of knowledge. Navigation replaces navigation. Visibility gives way to abstraction. Landmarks disappear beyond the horizon. At first, the change is partial. A land bridge floods seasonally. A coastal route becomes unreliable at certain times. Crossings are still possible with planning and luck. In these moments, experimentation is rewarded. Rafts, boats, techniques for hugging the shore, ways of reading wind and current. Some societies adapt and become comfortable at the edge of this new world. Others turn away. And as oceans widen further, adaptation becomes specialization. Those who succeed at crossing water develop distinct skills and identity. Coastal knowledge becomes central. Currents, tides, winds, stars. Inland groups lose contact with the sea, and water becomes an edge rather than a corridor. This divergence reshapes civilization more deeply than climate alone. Land routes allow gradual exchange. Water enforces thresholds. Either you cross or you cannot. There is little middle ground. Once that threshold hardens, reconnection becomes rare and then vanishes. Mountains do their own quieter work. Unlike oceans, they do not always prevent movement outright. They slow it. They filter it. They shape it. As tectonic forces reshape continents, mountain ranges rise where plates collide or crust thickens during breakup. These ranges alter climate, redirect rivers, create ecological divides. A mountain range does not have to be impossible to serve as a border. It only needs to be inconvenient enough to reduce contact. Fewer crossings mean fewer interactions. And over time, that reduction compounds. Language diverges. Practices shift. What was once shared becomes regional. Unlike political borders, mountains do not negotiate. They persist long enough to reshape entire trajectories, biological and cultural. Species on one side adapt to different conditions than those on the other. Intelligent beings do the same. Knowledge that depends on frequent exchange loses coherence. The combined effect of oceans and mountains is fragmentation with finality. Routes do not just become longer, they disappear. Memory tied to those roots loses relevance. Stories of distant places become abstract. Eventually they fade. And because the process is slow, it feels natural from within. No one declares the world disconnected. People simply stop traveling as far. They stop expecting visitors from certain directions. Horizons shrink, and that contraction may even feel stabilizing. Fewer external influences, fewer disruptions. Local tradition hardens. Identity becomes clear. But the cost is invisible and enormous. Loss of redundancy, loss of shared problem solving, loss of access to ideas refined elsewhere. Civilization at scale depends on circulation of goods, of people, of knowledge. When oceans erase routes, circulation becomes selective. When mountains harden into barriers, circulation becomes conditional. Over time, scale collapses. What might once have been a planet-wide system, if it existed at all, becomes a series of fragments. Each fragment may still be intelligent and culturally rich, but none retains awareness of the larger structure that once connected them. From the geological record, this transition is loud. Ocean basins open, continental margins form, mountain belts rise. Those signatures are studied and reconstructed with confidence. What they do not record is the social cost. They do not capture the moment a journey stopped being attempted, the point when a shared tradition ceased to be reinforced. Those losses happen in behavior, They leave no layer, no fossil, no clean anomaly. As oceans expand, time itself changes character. Communication delays stretch beyond usefulness. Planning horizons shorten. Coordination across distance becomes impractical. Large projects lose feasibility. Local concerns dominate. Mountains reinforce this inward turn. Valleys become worlds unto themselves. High passes become points of control or avoidance. Even when crossings exist, they funnel interaction into narrow channels, amplifying disruption when those channels fail. Eventually, the planet reaches a new equilibrium. Continents separate. Oceans widen, mountains stabilize and erode. Life adapts. From that point, reconnection is no longer part of the system's dynamics. Separation is complete. Any civilization that rose in the age of connection would now exist, if at all, as isolated descendants without awareness of shared origin. Their histories would begin locally. Their myths would explain separation without reference to unity. The idea that roads once crossed what is now open ocean would sound absurd. This is how erasure happens on a planetary scale, not through destruction alone, but through replacement. Old pathways are not violently removed. They are overwritten by new realities until they no longer make sense. From our position now looking back, we see continents drifting, oceans forming, mountains rising. We infer the physical processes. What we cannot see is the quiet dissolution of systems that required a different geography to survive. And understanding this does not require belief in a lost civilization. It requires recognition that geography sets limits on what can persist. Intelligence does not float above the planet that supports it. It is anchored to pathways, resources, contact. When those anchors move or vanish, intelligence must shrink its scope or disappear. Very little of the world we live in now would survive 100 million years. Almost none of it would survive in a form we would recognize. That sounds dramatic, but it's not a warning. It's simply a description of how the Earth works. The planet is not a storage device. It is a system in constant motion, one that recycles its surface over and over again. When viewed through that lens, the disappearance of evidence stops being mysterious and starts becoming inevitable. To understand why almost nothing would survive for us to find, it helps to loosen our grip on how short human history feels. 10,000 years already sounds ancient. 100,000 pushes the limits of familiarity. 1,000,000 becomes abstract. Yet Pangaea began to break apart more than 200 million years ago. That is not just longer than recorded history. It is longer than the entire existence of our species, by several orders of magnitude. Over such spans, the rules change. The most important rule is that the Earth actively destroys its own surface. Continental crust is not immortal. It cracks, bends, erodes, subducts, melts, and reforms. Oceanic crust is even more temporary. None of the seafloor we see today is older than about 200 million years, because it is constantly being created at mid-ocean ridges and consumed at subduction zones. Anything that once existed on older ocean floors is simply gone. Even continental surfaces, which last longer, are not safe. Erosion alone is enough to erase almost any structure given enough time. Wind, water, ice, chemical weathering, these grind mountains into sediment. Rivers carry that sediment away, spreading it across floodplains and into oceans. Over millions of years, entire mountain ranges vanish, reduced to flat landscapes that later rise again in different forms. A city built of stone might survive a few thousand years if abandoned. Given tens of thousands, it becomes rubble. Given hundreds of thousands, that rubble is dispersed. Given millions, it's buried, altered, or destroyed. Given hundreds of millions, it does not exist in any meaningful sense at all. Its atoms still belong to the Earth, but rearranged beyond recognition. Burial does not guarantee preservation. Sediment compacts. Heat rises. Chemistry changes. Rock metamorphoses. Original textures disappear. Distinct shapes blur. Even fossils, already miracles, represent an extraordinarily small fraction of what once lived. The conditions required for fossilization are narrow, and even fossils that do form are often destroyed later by tectonic processes. Now consider the materials we associate with civilization. Wood rots, fibers decay, leather, hide, Plant-based materials vanish quickly unless preserved in exceptional conditions. Metals corrode. Even relatively stable metals oxidize and disperse. Iron rusts aggressively. Over deep time, metal artifacts break down into minerals indistinguishable from naturally occurring ones. Stone tools fare better, but only marginally. Stone survives. Context does not. A shaped tool is meaningful only if it can be distinguished from naturally fractured rock, and that distinction depends on edges, surfaces, and the surrounding layer where it was found. Over millions of years, edges wear down. Surfaces abrade. Pieces are transported, mixed, broken, redeposited. Without context, intention becomes impossible to prove. Even if an artifact survived physically, recognizing it would be another challenge entirely. Archaeology relies on patterns, repeated shapes, associated materials, stratigraphic continuity. In deep time, those patterns are scrambled. Layers are folded, overturned, eroded, and reassembled. What was once a clear sequence becomes a geological puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Fire is often cited as a key indicator of intelligence, but fire fails to leave clear long-term traces. Charcoal can persist, but charcoal is common in the geological record because wildfire is common. Differentiating intentional fire use from natural burning requires consistent pattern and context. Over hundreds of millions of years, those patterns dissolve into noise. Agriculture, if it existed, would leave subtle signatures rather than obvious ruins. Changes in pollen, altered species composition, modified soils. But these can also result from natural climate change, tectonic uplift, volcanic activity. Separating intentional influence from natural process becomes increasingly speculative as time stretches. Even large-scale modification, deforestation, irrigation blurs, forests regrow, rivers shift, sediment redistributes. What looks deliberate on short time scales becomes indistinguishable from landscape evolution on long ones. Mining, even if extensive, does not guarantee recognition. Mines collapse. Tunnels fill. Excavated material erodes and spreads. Chemical signatures disperse. Given enough time, a mine becomes just another irregularity, easy to attribute to natural variation. It's tempting to believe intelligence would leave behind something unmistakable, something too precise, too complex to be natural. But nature produces extraordinary complexity on its own. Crystals form perfect geometries. Biology creates intricate structures. Geology produces formations that look artificial until you understand how they form. The standard for proving intentionality becomes extremely high. And it should be. Another factor is scale. A civilization existing before the breakup of Pangaea would not necessarily cover the supercontinent uniformly. Even today, with billions of people, we occupy only a fraction of the planet intensively. Vast regions remain lightly touched. An earlier civilization, especially one that valued balance over extraction, might leave an even smaller footprint. And that footprint would then be subjected to the most violent reshaping the planet has to offer. Continental breakup is not gentle when measured in consequences. It involves massive volcanism, faulting, uplift, and subsidence. Regions are stretched, flooded, buried under miles of lava flows. The Central Atlantic magmatic province associated with Pangaea's breakup covered millions of square miles with basalt. Anything on the surface beneath those flows would be obliterated. Subduction adds another layer of erasure. Entire sections of crust are dragged into the mantle. Heat and pressure destroy all surface features. No artifact survives that journey. It is not buried, it is unmade. Even regions that avoid subduction are not safe. Isostatic rebound lifts some buried surfaces, exposing them to erosion. Other regions sink and accumulate sediment, compressing and altering whatever lies beneath. Over time, the surface we see becomes a patchwork assembled from fragments of different ages with enormous gaps between them. Preservation is not just unlikely. It is selective in ways that bias what we can ever know. What survives tends to be simple, hard, chemically stable. Complex systems, social structure, behavior, intention leave almost nothing. This is why the fossil record holds shells and bones, but not soft-bodied ecosystems. It's why entire chapters of life can vanish without clear explanation. It's why even relatively recent events can be difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Human intuition struggles with this because the planet feels stable. We build on bedrock and expect it to stay. But bedrock is temporary. It simply moves on a timescale that falls below our daily perception. When people imagine a lost civilization, the first question is usually, Why haven't we found the ruins? The more appropriate question is, why would we expect ruins to survive? The conditions required to preserve recognizable ruins for hundreds of millions of years are so rare and specific that expecting them becomes unreasonable. Even if a civilization left something truly distinctive, it would need to survive every destructive process, remain accessible, and be interpreted correctly by a later species. Each requirement multiplies improbability. Interpretation matters as much as survival. Finding something unusual is not the same as recognizing it as evidence of intelligence. Geology is full of oddities. Without clear context, unusual formations are explained through natural processes because natural processes already produce endless variety. Science is cautious by necessity. It demands evidence that can withstand scrutiny. And in deep time, evidence degrades faster than standards relax. This creates a gap between what might have existed and what can be demonstrated. That gap does not mean anything can be claimed. It means certainty has limits. The absence of evidence for ancient intelligence is expected under the conditions that Earth imposes. It does not strongly argue for or against the idea on its own. What remains instead are constraints, what the Earth can preserve, what it reliably erases, what patterns we can and cannot expect after immense spans. These constraints shape how we interpret silence. Almost nothing surviving is not a failure of discovery. It is a feature of planetary dynamics. The Earth is not trying to hide its past. It is simply indifferent to preserving it. Understanding this shifts the conversation. The question becomes not, where are the ruins, but what kind of traces could possibly endure? And the answer is sobering. Very few. And those that do would be ambiguous at best. As continents drifted apart, as oceans widened and mountains rose, the planet systematically dismantled the physical context in which any early civilization might have existed. Roots flooded, settlements buried or eroded, regions subducted or resurfaced. Over time, even the memory of those places, if it survived biologically, would lose any anchor in the physical world. From our position now, looking back, the record appears empty. But emptiness in the record does not mean emptiness in reality. It means the medium could not hold the message. And once you accept that, another quiet thought arrives. Because if physical evidence can vanish so completely, then what remains, if anything remains, would most likely survive in a different form. Not in stone, not in metal, not in ruins, but in echoes, in stories that travel farther than objects ever can, in patterns that outlast the things that created them. Across cultures that never met, across landscapes that were never connected within recorded history, certain stories keep appearing. They don't arrive with the same names. They don't come in the same voice, but they circle familiar themes. A world that was once whole, a great separation, land swallowed by water, paths that vanished, ancestors who came from somewhere no longer reachable. These are usually gathered under one word: myth. A word that often implies fiction, imagination, symbolic truth, rather than history. But myth is not simply invention. Myth is memory that has lost its original frame. When physical evidence disappears, memory does not vanish instantly. It changes shape. Knowledge that can no longer be verified against the landscape stops being technical and becomes narrative. Practical instruction turns into story. Observation becomes symbol. Meaning survives even when mechanism is forgotten. This is how echoes form, not as records of specific events, but as impressions carried forward through generations. Deep time stretches echoes thin. Each retelling simplifies, localizes, adapts to new environments. A story once describing slow sea intrusion becomes, generations later, a sudden flood sent by gods or fate. A memory of routes disappearing underwater becomes a tale of lost lands, sunken worlds, unreachable homelands. The truth is not preserved in accuracy. It is preserved in persistence, and persistence itself can be data. It is tempting to dismiss these repeating motifs as coincidence or shared psychology. Water is frightening, separation hurts, loss demands explanation. All of that is real. But the consistency of certain motifs appearing independently across distant cultures suggests something deeper than coincidence. Not a single event remembered perfectly, but a shared pattern of experience repeated across different regions as the planet itself changed. If a civilization existed during the breakup of Pangaea, its experience of separation would not be one catastrophe. It would be an ongoing process unfolding across thousands of generations. No one would remember the beginning. No one would live to see the end. Memory would track fragments. The land used to extend farther. The journey used to be shorter. The crossing used to be possible. These are the kinds of memories that don't preserve well as technical history. They become absence. They become feeling. Myth is well suited to that. It preserves emotional truth when factual detail cannot survive. And if myth preserves anything across deep time, it tends to preserve relationship. Who belonged to whom? What was shared? What was taken away? That makes it an unusually good vessel for remembering separation. Modern humans often underestimate how long oral memory can persist. In some cases, indigenous oral traditions have preserved references to real geological events, volcanic eruptions, sea level rise across thousands of years. Not with precision, but with enough consistency to be recognizable when compared to physical evidence. Scale that persistence outward into deeper time, and memory becomes less precise. But it doesn't become meaningless. It becomes archetypal rather than historical. A flood instead of shoreline retreat. A great divide instead of widening rift. A lost homeland instead of receding landmass. Skepticism belongs here. Not every myth encodes ancient truth. Human imagination is powerful, and narrative patterns recur for many reasons. But dismissing myth as irrelevant to deep history ignores how intelligent beings transmit understanding in the absence of written record. If intelligence existed before Pangaea split and then fractured into isolation, myth would be one of the few carriers capable of bridging such loss, imperfectly, but persistently. It would not tell us what happened in detail. It would tell us how it felt. The long shadow of deep time ensures that by the time later civilizations arise, these echoes no longer look like memory. They look timeless, universal, detached from any specific past. But that timelessness can be misleading. It may be the result of extreme age, not eternal origin. From our perspective now, myths appear alongside a geological record largely silent about intelligence before humans. The silence and the stories seem unrelated. But silence is expected, and stories are resilient. They occupy different registers of memory. None of this proves a first civilization existed. Proof requires evidence, and deep time erases most evidence. What this offers instead is coherence. It explains why the idea of a lost past feels compelling across cultures even when physical confirmation is absent. It explains why the Earth feels older than our histories, heavier with experience than our records can account for. And as the planet continued reshaping itself, those echoes would fade further. New civilizations would rise on separated continents, each believing itself unique, each building origin stories, unaware that the sense of loss embedded in those stories might not be purely symbolic. Deep time casts long shadows, not because it hides secrets on purpose, but because it stretches memory beyond its limits. What remains are outlines, impressions, a feeling that something once connected the world more closely than it does now. It is an uncomfortable thought, not because it is frightening, but because it unsettles something we rarely question. The idea that humanity might not be the first intelligence to organize itself at scale on this planet challenges the quiet assumption that our story begins at the beginning. We tend to see ourselves as pioneers standing at the edge of a blank past, with nothing behind us but simple life inching forward until it finally reached us. But the Earth's history does not resemble a straight path. It looks more like a series of experiments, most of them ending quietly without ceremony, without leaving instructions for what comes next. If humanity is a second attempt or a later attempt, then we did not inherit a pristine world. We arrived on a planet already shaped by forces far older than our species, forces that had already tested complexity, connection, and collapse in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. By the time humans began spreading across the continents, The Earth had already broken itself apart, stitched itself back together in other forms, and erased most traces of what came before. Whatever intelligence may have existed earlier, if any, would not have left us a warning. Not because it was careless, because the planet does not keep warnings intact. We would be learning everything again from scratch without knowing it. That lack of awareness is not a failure of imagination. It is a consequence of scale. Humans evolved in a world where the continents were already separate, where oceans felt eternal, where mountains appeared fixed, where the ground under our feet seemed stable enough to build on indefinitely. Our sense of permanence is shaped by the stability of the Holocene, a brief window of relative calm in an otherwise restless planetary history. Within that window, agriculture became viable. Settlements expanded. Writing emerged. Memory externalized itself into objects. Civilization, as we recognize it, took shape. From within this experience, it feels natural to assume no one else reached a similar point before us. We look backward and see no cities older than a certain age, no machines embedded in ancient rock, no inscriptions predating known history. But that expectation rests on a misunderstanding of what deep time does to evidence. It assumes success must announce itself loudly and permanently. It assumes intelligence inevitably produces domination of the landscape in ways that cannot be erased. Yet our own civilization, if stripped of its ongoing maintenance, would not survive long in recognizable form. Cities collapse within centuries. Infrastructure decays within decades. Left alone, even our most impressive constructions would be swallowed by vegetation, eroded by weather, reduced to sediment. Extend that process across tens of millions of years, and almost nothing remains that could be confidently identified as intentional. If an earlier civilization existed, its disappearance would not require a dramatic ending. It would not need to be erased by an asteroid or a global fire. It could simply be overtaken by the same forces that now test us: climate change, geographic fragmentation, loss of connectivity, environmental shifts that outpace adaptation. In that sense, the Earth does not need to be hostile to intelligence. It only needs to remain indifferent. Humanity's rise, then, would not represent the culmination of a linear progression. It would represent the reopening of a possibility. Intelligence emerges when conditions allow it. It organizes itself when stability permits. It expands when connectivity supports it. And it fragments when those supports fail. None of this requires destiny. It is a pattern that can repeat. What makes the thought unsettling is not the possibility of predecessors. It is the implication that success is temporary by default. If someone came before us and vanished without trace, then permanence is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. It depends on how intelligence interacts with the planet hosting it. Humans speak of mastering nature, but in reality, we operate within narrow margins defined by climate, geography, and energy. Our technologies amplify reach. They also bind us to complex systems that require constant coordination. The more interconnected we become, the more vulnerable we are to disruption. This trade-off is not unique to us. Any civilization scaling beyond local life faces the same tension. If a previous intelligence learned this and chose restraint over expansion, it might leave even fewer traces. A civilization that avoids large-scale extraction, monumental construction, and irreversible landscape modification would be nearly invisible in the deep past. Its success would be measured in longevity rather than imprint. From our perspective, that success would look like absence. Alternatively, a civilization might expand, fragment, and simplify as the planet reshaped itself. By the time humans arrived, only scattered descendants might remain biologically or behaviorally altered beyond recognition. Intelligence could recede rather than vanish outright, returning to forms that leave little trace. And that leads to a difficult question about us. Are we aware of the conditions supporting our civilization, or do we mistake them for constants? Oceans feel permanent. Continents feel stable. Climate feels predictable. But these are temporary states in a much longer cycle. The same processes that broke Pangaea apart are still operating now, just at speeds below daily perception. Humanity's global civilization depends on connectivity, trade routes, communication networks, shared standards, collective knowledge. These are our equivalents of the land corridors and routes that once held a unified world together. We assume they will persist because they have persisted through our recorded history. But recorded history is short. If connectivity breaks, not abruptly, but gradually, through climate stress, resource pressure, political fragmentation, our systems could simplify without a clear moment of collapse. Knowledge would localize, technology would diverge, global coordination would weaken, intelligence would persist, but at reduced scale. Seen this way, humanity does not stand apart from hypothetical predecessors. We live under the same constraints. We are not special because we are intelligent. We are subject to the same planetary processes that would shape any earlier attempt. And the most striking similarity would be unawareness. If an earlier civilization existed, it likely did not know it was early. It would not experience itself as a trial run. It would experience its world as complete, stable enough, open-ended enough. Only in retrospect would its place in deep time become clear. And retrospection requires survivors. Humanity too does not experience itself as temporary. We plan in decades, sometimes centuries, rarely longer. Institutions struggle to account for timescales beyond immediate relevance. Yet the Earth operates on timescales that make our longest plans brief. The absence of inherited knowledge from a previous civilization would not be surprising. Even if such knowledge existed, it would require continuity to survive. Writing alone is insufficient without readers. Monuments alone are meaningless without context. Technologies decay without maintenance. Memory requires an unbroken chain of transmission. Continental drift is exceptionally good at breaking chains. If humanity is unaware of the first attempt, it is because awareness itself could not survive the transition. The planet did not preserve it, not out of malice. Because preservation is not its function, this does not mean humanity is doomed to repeat the same outcome. Repetition does not imply inevitability. It implies constraint. Understanding constraint is the only way to respond differently. Whether we can or will is open. Thinking of humanity as a later attempt reframes progress. Instead of standing at the top of a ladder, we might be standing on a platform temporarily supported by conditions we did not create and cannot control indefinitely. This does not diminish our achievements. It contextualizes them. It changes how we interpret silence. The lack of evidence for prior intelligence stops being proof of uniqueness. It becomes a reminder of how thoroughly the Earth edits its past. Silence is not emptiness. It is compression. If intelligence has arisen more than once, then the Earth is not waiting for a single perfect outcome. It is exploring possibilities. Some last longer than others. None are guaranteed permanence. Humanity's challenge, then, is not to assume primacy. It is to recognize fragility. To understand civilization is not an endpoint. It is a phase dependent on geography, climate, energy, and connection remaining within certain bounds. And we are now reshaping the planet faster than any natural process has done in millions of years. We may be testing those bounds again. Whether this leads to persistence, fragmentation, or disappearance is not written yet. What is clear is that awareness alone does not protect against the forces shaping deep time. If we are a later attempt unaware of earlier ones, then the most important question is not who came before. It is what conditions allowed us to arise at all. Because those conditions are changing. And they will continue changing long after any single generation is gone. Beneath every landscape we recognize, there is another one folded away, compressed, altered, and largely inaccessible, yet not entirely gone. The Earth does not remember in the way minds do. It does not recall events or preserve meaning. What it does instead is record pressure, chemistry, movement, and time. Even when almost everything is erased, something is carried forward, not as narrative, but as consequence. If the first civilization disappeared when Pangaea split, and if humanity arrived much later without awareness, then the only witness spanning both moments is the planet itself, not as a conscious observer, as a medium through which cause and effect propagate endlessly. The Earth might not remember who lived, but it remembers that something lived. It remembers disturbance, adaptation, imbalance, recovery. Those memories are subtle, encoded in places we rarely think to look. Consider how the Earth responds to life in general. Living systems do not simply occupy space, they alter it. They change atmospheric composition, soil structure, erosion rates, biological relationships. Over long periods, these changes accumulate into planetary signatures. Oxygen in the atmosphere is one of those signatures, a lasting consequence of ancient biological activity that transformed the planet. No organism intended to create an oxygen-rich world, yet the Earth still carries that imprint billions of years later. If an early intelligent civilization existed, it would not be remembered as cities. It would be remembered as shifts layered on top of natural processes. Slightly accelerated erosion where landscapes were managed, subtle redistribution of species where movement was intentional, changes in fire regimes where burning was controlled. None of this announces intelligence directly. Meaning dissolves faster than effect. The Earth does not label its memories. It does not distinguish between intentional and accidental. A forest burned by lightning and a forest burned deliberately can look identical after enough time. A species moved by climate drift and a species moved by deliberate agency leave similar traces once context is gone. This is why searching for memory in the Earth is not about finding anomalies that scream intention. It is about noticing cumulative effects that seem slightly out of proportion, yet still explainable by known drivers. The planet remembers by consequence, by exaggeration, not by inscription. There is also memory in absence. When something disappears, it leaves a vacancy. Extinctions create openings. Fragmentation reshapes evolutionary paths. A civilization vanishing during continental breakup would leave ecological and cultural voids that later life would inhabit without awareness. The Earth would remember not the thing, but the reshaping caused by its removal. This kind of memory is indirect. It does not allow reconstruction with confidence. It allows inference. Scientists already work this way when reconstructing ancient climates and ecosystems. Temperature from isotopes, rainfall from sediment, vegetation from pollen, each line of evidence partial. Together a picture, always provisional. If intelligence influenced those systems, its signal would be diluted among many others. Distinguishing it would require plausibility, and plausibility rarely satisfies the demand for proof. Yet here is the strange twist. Humanity is now leaving marks that will persist for millions of years. Not our names, not our stories, our consequences, altered carbon cycles, rapid species redistribution, novel materials embedded in sediments. These are the kinds of memories the planet keeps. And that means we understand better than ever how an earlier civilization could vanish without trace. We can see how quickly meaning disappears even while effect remains. A future intelligence looking back through rock layers might detect a brief disruption, a spike, a reorganization. Whether it would interpret that as intelligence is uncertain. What the Earth might still remember, even if we do not, is rhythm. Periods of increasing complexity, followed by fragmentation, expansion, followed by constraint, connection, followed by isolation. These rhythms recur because they are driven by planetary dynamics. Continental drift enforces separation. Climate oscillations enforce adaptation. Resource distribution enforces movement. These forces shape life regardless of intelligence. Intelligence does not escape them. It responds within them. From this perspective, humanity is not unique in facing a forgetting planet. We are simply conscious of it in ways earlier intelligences may not have been. That awareness does not grant immunity. It grants responsibility, and perhaps humility. The Earth will continue to remember in its own way long after our records are gone. Long after languages vanish, long after cities erode. It will carry forward the consequences of what lived here, smoothing them, blending them, integrating them into whatever comes next. There is a quiet comfort in that, not because it promises preservation, because it places us within continuity that does not depend on being remembered. Life participates, it alters the system responds. Nothing is truly wasted even when nothing is retained in recognizable form. If there was a first civilization, its greatest legacy would not be a ruin waiting to be found. It would be the fact that the planet was capable of supporting such complexity at all. That possibility, once realized, does not vanish. It reappears when conditions allow. Humanity's existence is evidence of that capacity, regardless of what came before. We are not proof of uniqueness. We are proof of recurrence. The Earth remembers recurrence. It remembers complexity arising, connection forming, fragmentation undoing it, and, given enough time, the cycle beginning again. When we imagine the deep past, it's tempting to seek closure, To want a definitive answer, was there someone before us or not? Deep time does not offer closure. It offers continuity without narrative, memory without meaning, record without interpretation. What the earth might still remember is not a story we can read. It is a pattern we are living inside. Whether we recognize it or not, we are part of the same long experiment shaped by the same forces, moving toward outcomes we cannot fully predict. The planet will not judge this attempt against the last. It will not compare successes or failures. It will simply continue carrying forward whatever effects remain, discarding whatever cannot persist. In that sense, the Earth does not forget us. It transforms us. And long after our own memories fade, something of what we did, how we lived, how we interacted with this moving world will remain embedded in slow processes that outlast all stories, not as evidence waiting to be found, as consequence already unfolding, folded into the future of a planet that has always been less concerned with who remembers than with what continues. Before we let this thought settle too deeply, it helps to return gently to the only place we ever truly stand, not on an ancient map, not on a reconstructed supercontinent, but on the present ground beneath you, right now. The floor under your feet feels still. The walls around you feel steady. Even the air in your room seems like something separate from geology, separate from tectonics, separate from deep time. Yet the surface you live on is temporary. Not in the dramatic sense, no countdown, no alarm, but in the quiet, absolute sense that the planet does not stop moving, simply because we have arranged our lives as if it might. The oceans we cross feel permanent because they outlast us. The continents feel permanent because they outlast our recorded history. But permanence, on Earth, is mostly a matter of scale. Time is the difference between solid and recycled. In the span of a human lifetime, continents do not move in ways you can see. In the span of a species, they move enough to reshape climate and migration. In the span of a supercontinent cycle, they rearrange the entire meaning of distance. The world you learned as a child, this distribution of land and water, this particular arrangement of coastlines, this is a phase, not an error, not an anomaly, a phase. And that matters because so much of what we call civilization is built on the assumption that the phase will last. We build cities where water is predictable. We grow food where seasons are stable. We design supply chains assuming routes will remain open. We store knowledge in networks we expect to survive. And we don't do this because we are foolish. We do it because we are adapted to the scale of our own lives. We are not adapted intuitively to the scale of the planet. So when we ask whether there could have been an earlier intelligence, an earlier civilization, an earlier attempt at organized life, we are really asking something else underneath it. How much can the Earth hold? How much can it preserve? How much can it erase? Because if the planet edits its surface relentlessly, then the absence of old monuments tells us very little about what once lived here. It tells us mostly about the medium. It tells us that rock is not memory in the way we want it to be. It is record without narrative, and narrative is what we crave. We want the past to look like a hallway with doors we can open. We want to walk back and find rooms intact. But deep time is not a hallway. It is weather. It is pressure. It is heat. It is the slow folding of the floor plan until the rooms no longer exist. That doesn't mean the question is meaningless. It means the question belongs to a different kind of listening. Not listening for artifacts, but listening for constraints. Not listening for a lost city, but listening for what kinds of signatures could possibly survive. Not listening for certainty, but for the shape of plausibility. And the shape of plausibility is strange. On the one hand, we know intelligence can emerge. We are here. We also know it can emerge in multiple forms, along multiple paths, under different conditions. We see hints of it throughout life. We see problem solving, memory, social learning, tool use, cooperation. Evolution does not seem reluctant to experiment. On the other hand, we know the Earth is extraordinarily good at erasing surface complexity. Subduction unmakes continents. Erosion grinds mountains down. Volcanism buries landscapes. Sediments compress and metamorphose. Oceans recycle their floors. Given enough time, almost everything becomes anonymous again. So the deep past is not empty because nothing happened. It is quiet because the planet is loud in its own way. Loud with processes that drown delicate signals. And if something as fragile as intention is to survive that noise, it would have to take a form we rarely think to look for. A faint chemical imbalance, a persistent shift in fire regimes, a pattern in species movement that is hard to explain by climate alone. Not one clue, but many small ones aligning. Even then, interpretation would remain tentative. Because deep time does not offer clean experiments. It offers puzzles with missing pieces. And so the question of a first civilization during Pangaea may remain forever unresolved. Not because it is forbidden knowledge, because resolution is not always available. The Earth does not owe us an answer. It continues regardless of our curiosity. That can feel frustrating, but it can also be strangely freeing. Because if certainty is unavailable, we are released from the need to force a conclusion. We can hold the idea lightly. We can treat it as a lens rather than a claim. A way of seeing the planet's scale more clearly. A way of recognizing that history is not the same thing as the past. History is the part of the past that survives into a form we can read. Most of the past is unreadable. Most of the past is gone, not in the sense that it didn't happen, but in the sense that it can no longer be distinguished from everything else that happened. When you realize that, the present begins to look different. Not smaller, just less permanent. It becomes clear that our own era, our cities, our digital archives, our monuments, our names, are not guaranteed to persist as evidence. Some traces might linger, many will not. And if we imagine a future intelligence looking back at us across deep time, the picture becomes almost unfamiliar. They might find a thin layer of disruption, a brief chemical signature, a sudden rearrangement of species, maybe some novel materials. They would not find our stories intact. They would not find our languages preserved. They would not find our intentions written in stone. They would find consequences. And that should sound familiar now, because that is exactly what we expect from any hypothetical civilization that came before us. Not a narrative, a residue. That symmetry is worth holding. It suggests humility. It suggests caution when we declare ourselves unique, based solely on the silence behind us. It suggests that what we call evidence is partly a reflection of time's generosity. We exist in a recent layer. We can still find things. We can still read inscriptions. We can still excavate foundations. In deep time, that privilege disappears. The Earth does not preserve. It repurposes. So perhaps the most practical takeaway from this thought experiment is not about the past at all. It's about how we think. It asks us to notice how easily we confuse absence with emptiness, how quickly we assume no trace means no existence, how narrow our definitions can be when we insist intelligence must look like us. And it asks us quietly to consider what kind of civilization we are becoming. Because we are leaving traces, we are changing cycles, we are altering the chemistry, we are reshaping habitats. We are doing so quickly enough that even on geological scales, it may register as a sharp turn. If a future mind ever tries to interpret us, it will likely do so the way we interpret deep time now, through constrained evidence, through patterns, through consequence, not through memory. That recognition can shift the weight of the present. If the Earth does not preserve intention, then the only place intention truly exists is in the living moment. In choices, in structures maintained, in relationships sustained, in knowledge transmitted, in the careful decision to build in ways that do not require permanence as proof, because deep time does not reward proof. It rewards adaptability. It rewards what can survive changing context. And if there was a first civilization that rose on a whole Earth, it would have faced the same reality we face, whether it understood it or not. That stability is borrowed, that connection is fragile, that the ground moves, and that real memory lives in living systems, not in stone. So tonight, as you listen, you can let the question remain open. You do not have to choose belief or disbelief. You can simply hold the possibility the way you hold the idea of distant galaxies or ancient oceans, something vast that reminds you of scale. A reminder that we live on a planet with a history deeper than our records and a future longer than our plans. And when you're ready, bring your attention back again to where you are, to the air in your room, to the sound of your own breathing, to the quiet presence of the earth under everything. It feels still, but it is not. It is moving, slowly, relentlessly carrying continents, opening and closing oceans, raising mountains, erasing them, recycling the surface again and again. And in that motion, life keeps emerging. Not once, again and again, trying new forms, building new connections, losing them, starting over. If there is any comfort here, it is not in certainty. It is in continuity. The world changes, and life continues to meet it. This is Echoes of the Forgotten Earth. And for now, that's enough.